Heartily welcome to this live stream from Med Israel for Fred. We are really honored to have Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf together with us tonight. They will present their new book, The War of Return, eller Krigen for å vende tilbake. MIFF is honored to be the third to have this book published now in the third language, just a few weeks after it was first published in English. Einat, we know Einat from a few years back when she was the keynote speaker in one of our national conferences. And as soon as I saw that she was going to publish a book about this important topic, we didn't need to read the book before we decided to publish it. So I think we actually decided to publish it before we saw the text. She co-authored this book together with Adi Schwartz, who is a researcher, journalist, and I will not waste our time presenting all their comprehensive CVs, bios. Einat Wilf, of course, as you know, is a former member of Knesset. And I will just kick us off with this. Welcome, Einat. Welcome, Adi. Please, you have the microphone.
Thank you so much, Conrad and MIFF. It's truly an exciting opportunity to do this, to digitally visit Norway and to meet with you. And we're especially honored that you're publishing the book in Norwegian. It came out initially in Hebrew and now in English, and with you in Norwegian. And this is very exciting. So thank you. So a little bit about the background of why Adi and I even began to think about the issue and decided to devote to it enough time to write a book. I think each one of us by now has spent at least a decade really dealing with the issue. And we're unlikely people in terms of the issue. Both Adi and I come from what is known as the Israeli left. Politically, socially, Adi worked as a senior editor and a journalist for Haaretz, which I'm sure you know is very much associated with the Israeli left in Israel. I was a member of the Labor Party. I worked with Shimon Peres, with Yossi Beilin, who was the architect of the Oslo Accords. So we are deep from the Israeli left and the Israeli peace camp. And how is it that we even came to this issue? The reason was, of course, that we grew up with the promise of the Israeli peace camp, which really became pronounced in the 80s and in the 1990s with a single formula. It had a certain simplicity and elegance, almost a mathematical equation, which basically said all that Israel has to do in order to achieve peace with its Arab neighbors is to hand over land which Israel acquired as a result of the Six-Day War in 1967. So we're talking about the Sinai Peninsula in the south, the Golan Heights in the north, and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in the center. So the idea was very simple. Israel will hand over this land, and in return, Israel should expect to have peace with its Arab neighbors, peace which it did not get after the War of 1948, when its Arab neighbors only signed ceasefire agreements with Israel because in their mind, they were going to continue the war, and this was merely a cessation of fire, a temporary one. So for a while, this formula worked beautifully. Israel signed a peace agreement with Egypt based on the formula, handing over every square centimeter of the Sinai Peninsula and signing a peace agreement with Egypt. I think we can have an interesting discussion as to whether what we have today with the perspective of 40 years back should be called a peace agreement. But at the time, this was the idea. We signed a peace agreement with Egypt. We gave the Sinai Peninsula. And in the 1990s, this was the decade of this formula of land for peace. We were negotiating with the Syrians over the Golan Heights. We signed a peace agreement with Jordan when Jordan gave up its territorial claim to the West Bank. And of course, the highlight was the Oslo Accords. We negotiated with the PLO, with the Palestinians, over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. And the feeling was, I'm sure some of you remember, this was the decade of the end of history. The Soviet Union crumbles, Eastern Europe is free, Northern Ireland signs a peace agreement, apartheid in South Africa comes to an end. This was the decade of the end of history. And we also felt that we are ending the history of our conflict. And in the year 2000, ending the 90s, the head of the Israeli peace camp, elected on a platform of peace, Ehud Barak, head of the Labor Party, goes to Camp David, which was very symbolic. Camp David is where we negotiated peace with the Egyptians. And he puts on the table a very bold proposal. Even Rabin did not go so far. A fully independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. No settlements. They were going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. So no settlements, fully independent Palestinian state, which meant the end of the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Capital in East Jerusalem, including parts of the old city, so holy sites. So this was everything. Check the boxes. This was everything we were told that would bring us peace and the Palestinians wanted. Barak puts this proposal on the table. And what happens? Palestinians walk away. This repeats itself in 2008. Ehud Olmert puts a similar proposal, the same principles, even more far-reaching, but basically the same principles, and Abu Mazen this time walks away. And not only do they walk away, what follows is violence, especially after 2000, in 2001, 2, and 3. What we have is basically bloody massacre in our streets. Almost every day, a bloody suicide bombing, entire families blown to bits for going for pizza, families celebrating a Seder in a hotel, bombed, blown to bits, buses, cafes. This was just day after day of bloody massacre in our streets. And this was literally days and weeks after the Palestinians could have had their own state. And a lot of Israelis like myself of the peace camp began to ask a simple question. What do the Palestinians want? What are they after? They could have had a state at least twice in the time that I remember. We're not even going further back in history. And they didn't take it. They walked away. So what do they want? And as I was meeting Palestinians and beginning to research the issue, I realized that this was hiding in plain sight. And Adi also goes through a similar process. And we realized that the Palestinians have been telling us all along what they wanted, and we were just not listening. They wanted something that they called the right of return. And just so we understand what this means, the Palestinians claim to have millions. At the minimum, they say 5.5 million, which is the number registered by UNRWA, the UN agency which keeps alive the idea that Palestinians are still refugees. So the minimum number is 5.5 million. The Palestinians claim 8 or 9 million because they count even people who live in Norway or Sweden as refugees. So whether it's 5.5 million or 9 million, we're talking about millions of Palestinians who claim to be refugees from the war of 1948, even though most of the millions were born after 1948 and by now are the second, third, fourth, and even fifth generation descendants. And they claim to have a right, not just a wish, a right. They claim to have an internationally sanctioned legal right that supersedes the sovereignty of the state of Israel to settle inside the state of Israel in its pre-1967 ceasefire lines. And the right to settle in Israel, of course, as I'm sure you can do the math, if the millions realize it, the outcome is that the state of Israel becomes an Arab state, a Palestinian state, with a Jewish minority. This means that during all the years of the Oslo negotiations and agreements, when Palestinian leaders said that they support a two-state solution, while continuing to claim a right of return, the only two states they ever supported was a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Palestinian state to replace Israel. What we show in the book is that they've said it all along from 1948, 1949 to the present. They never stopped making that demand. And this is the reason we don't have peace. Because at every moment, the Palestinians, when they faced a choice between making peace with Israel and having their own state, end of the occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, but they would have to sign an agreement that said that there is no return into the state of Israel, they didn't want that kind of state. And they preferred to keep the war of return going. And what we especially detail in the book is not just that this is the Palestinian worldview, is that this Palestinian worldview has been sustained by Western support, by Norwegian money that goes every year into UNRWA and sustains the Palestinians in their worldview that the war of 1948 is actually not over. When Adi and I started the book, we had a simple question. How is it that from a war that ended more than 7 decades ago, we have millions of people who claim to be refugees and who believe they have a right of return, unlike millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of refugees throughout that period in history? And the answer is very simple. At the end of the book, we get to it. The reason is that from the Palestinian perspective, the war of 1948 is still not over. They refuse to accept that it's over. They refuse to accept that Israel has been established as an outcome of the war. And they still believe that with enough time, and if they wait 1 or 5 more generations, they can still undo the war of 1948 through return. And what we argue in the book is that it's one thing for the Palestinians to believe that, but it's a whole other thing for Norway and Western countries to support that and give money to this worldview. Adi?
Yes, thank you very much for having us, and I'm joining the greetings, and thank you for having us and for making this happen. So Einat gave you an overview of how we came to the book and of its content. What I would like to do is to share with you a vignette or two, a personal story that we're sharing in the book, because what we try to do is not only to make it a very factual book, and I think that for footnote lovers, it's a good book, but also to try to make it as lively as possible and filled with stories that can make it more tangible, that you can understand better the general development. So as Einat said, we asked ourselves, how is it that from a war that ended 71 years ago, 72, depending how you count, there are still more than 5 million refugees? And another question is, why weren't they resettled? If you look at all the refugees from the 40s, and unfortunately the 20th century was a very bloody century, and you had millions of refugees in Europe after World War II, Germans fleeing Czechoslovakia and fleeing Poland. You had a devastating war in Korea with millions of refugees. You had the split of India and Pakistan when the British leave the subcontinent. So there are many examples. And if you look today, none of these people, of these tens of millions of refugees, not even a single one is still a refugee. So what happened? What is the unique case of the Palestinians? Einat already gave you the answer, but let me tell you a story that might explain, I think, better than anything else, why this resettlement project was never actually successful. So the story goes like this. It is the story of Musa Alami, who was a prominent Palestinian aristocrat, you could say. He was the highest Palestinian member of the British Mandate establishment. He even conducted negotiations with Ben Gurion in the 30s about reaching some kind of understanding between Jews and Arabs. But later on in the 40s, he was one of the vocal voices in the Palestinian camp against the Jewish state. He tried to persuade the British to not leave Palestine, and they opened up offices in London. So he was one of the strongest voices against Jewish independence. And why is he interesting for us? Well, what's his importance? So when the war ends in 1948, this Musa Alami, witnessing the distress and the poverty of many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Now remember that in 48, 49, there were real refugees. These are people who fled their houses and lived in tents, and there was real poverty, you know. And he decided to embark on a very interesting project. He decided to create this exemplary village where he will take a few dozen refugees, perhaps hundreds of refugees, give them a plot of land. Remember that most of these refugees were farmers who used to cultivate their small plots of land, grow vegetables, etc., etc. And he wanted to give them plots of land, proper housing, and to bring them back into the economy, to resettle them, to reintegrate them somehow, to bring them back to life. Now, this was certainly not a pro-Zionist project. This man, Alami, in 1948, wrote a very important article against any kind of coexistence with Israel. It is one of the most famous articles in the among Palestinian writers and intellectuals. He even calls or explains how the Arabs should prepare for a second war, a second attack against Israel. So this wasn't a pro-Israeli, pro-Jewish approach, but definitely a pro-Palestinian in the sense of improving their lives. Now, interestingly, he found a plot of land just a bit north of the Dead Sea, near Jericho. And to the surprise of many people, he succeeds. And since the land there, for some reason, is very good because of the minerals, then he even manages to produce excellent fruits and vegetables and to export them to Jordan and to Saudi Arabia. And everybody who goes, who travels on the road between Jerusalem to Amman, this is where the village is located, is writing stories. He's called the Moses of the Arab world. So he becomes very famous. The New York Times profiles him, etc., etc. But there's only one problem. The only problem is that the Palestinians themselves, the refugees themselves, are not happy. So indeed, he succeeds to bring together a few dozens or 100 refugees, but in the camps in Jericho, which are very close to his village, there are thousands of refugees, other Palestinians, who are very angry at him. And from day one, they see him as a traitor, a pro-Zionist, pro-Jewish, pro-Western, imperialist. You can add whatever adjective you want. And why? Because he's betraying the idea of return. So from 1948, from the first moment, the dream, the wish, and the desire, the political and the personal agenda of all these refugees is to return back to Lida, to Ramla, to Yafo, to the houses and the places where they left. And even when a Palestinian, right, when one of them tries to bring them back to life and to improve their quality of life, they called him a traitor. And this wasn't only words. At some point in 1955, after waves of propaganda against him, they take one moment when he's not there, he's in Beirut or in London trying to raise money, and they simply, thousands of Palestinian refugees from the camps storm this village and burn it down to the end. So they beat up, and everybody there is Palestinian. So Palestinians beating Palestinians for betraying the dream of return. So going back to life is a bigger betrayal and a bigger humiliation than to keep on living in tents. And they simply destroy the entire village, burn it down, and physically attack kids and women, everything, and they leave it in ruin. Why is this story or this vignette important? Because it gives us a sense of what the Palestinians really want. This is what they want. There are also polls and all kinds of other evidence, but as Einat said before, when choosing between, she mentioned the fact of creating an independent state, but also an issue is of sometimes you hear about the dire conditions that the Palestinians live in, but you have to remember this is a choice. Later on, Israel offered many examples, many projects of resettlement, all kinds of, projects, and the Palestinians refused each and every one of them. For them, the only acceptable outcome is returning back to their homes, which are, as you understand, after 70 years, their homes are not there, but this is still their dream. Another very important point to understand here is that sometimes you hear the notion that, well, the Palestinians are just pawns in a bigger diplomatic game, and you have some Arab extreme leader, but at the end of the day, what do they really want? What do people really want? They want to get up in the morning, go to work and go back home, etc., etc. Unfortunately, this is not the case. The case with the Palestinians is that there is no an extreme leadership. If anything, it's the other way around. The leaders are going after the very authentic demands of the people, which is indeed truly to demand a right of return to inside Israel, what we call the pre-1967 Israel. So whenever you hear that they are captive of some kind of an extreme leadership like Hamas, etc., we came to the conclusion that then, as today, we have to take the Palestinians themselves very seriously, listen to what they say, and you can't just write it off as a huge population without voice was somehow manipulated against their will. No, you have to understand this is what they want. We have to confront this, and perhaps in the next few minutes or the questions that you have, we can also explain how we think we can do it.
Thanks a lot for that introduction. Sorry for that, some double sound here. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and I really hope that the viewers have got a little taste of the content, and this story about Musa Alami is really the story in the book that that stuck with me. So I was ready to. That was my question, Adi. My first question. If you could tell us about it. It's amazing that that he was faced with this violent opposition while wanting to create a new future. We have had several people wanting to ask questions. We will start with my colleague Rika, who is the director of MIFF in Denmark. You can just turn on your mic and go ahead.
Unmute. Hi. I was just thinking of something in the broader sense, because if the international community really means that all the Palestinians are refugees and are supposed to have the right to return to Israel, then what about all the Jewish refugees after the Holocaust in the Mediterranean countries? I mean, even going many generations back, what about them? Where's their right to get their houses back and to return to the countries that they came from? Why are they not seen as refugees when the Palestinians are? What's the difference? I mean, even
So, sorry, am I muted? Okay. Let me start and Adi will add. First of all, it's important to say the Palestinians are not refugees by any standard. I mean, we're trying to understand their unique situation, but by any international standard, they're not refugees. Just so we understand some of the absurdities that UNRWA has created, 40% of those registered by UNRWA, 2.2 million, are citizens of Jordan. Under international standards for all other refugees in the world, if you become a citizen of another country, you're no longer a refugee. And the citizens of Jordan, by now, they've been born in Jordan, they've lived there all their lives, they haven't even been displaced by war, and yet UNRWA registers them as refugees. It's the Palestinian exception. Another 40% live in the West Bank and Gaza, under the Palestinian Authority, under Hamas. They're in Palestine, definitely from their view. So they're not refugees from Palestine. Again, they've been born in Ramallah, they've been born in Gaza, they've lived there all their lives, they haven't been displaced by war. They're not refugees by any international standard. The remaining 20%, 1 million who are registered in Lebanon and Syria, we show in the book, most of them have left. They've become citizens of Germany, of Sweden, of Norway, but they're still registered as refugees from Palestine by UNRWA. So in truth, they're not refugees. And even when they were at the beginning, they did not have a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. Refugees, as a rule, do not possess a right of return into another sovereign state of which they were never citizens. This is again a Palestinian exception. And what we show in the book is that there's no such right in international law because the international legal system is based on the sanctity of sovereignty. You do not have in the international system another people having a right to settle in another country. You just don't have that. So there is no right of return, and the Palestinians are not refugees. So it's not to say, oh, the Jews should have a right of return. No, our argument is that no one has it and no one got it, and they're not refugees. In fact, the Jewish refugees from Arab countries is exactly how other refugees throughout the 20th century were treated. Basically, the message to refugees throughout the 20th century, whether they were Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Germans, Koreans, was tough. You know, it's sad, it's tragic, there was war, you lost your home, you're fled, move on, look to the future, build your life wherever you are. The Jews built their new life in Israel, in France, in the US. They're not looking back. And this is our message, that the Palestinians should be treated like all other refugees in the world, which is to say they need to acknowledge that the war of 1948 is over. They need to acknowledge that they're not refugees. And to the few of them who are still refugees from the older generation, they should be resettled like other refugees and look to the future rather than look to the back, look to history. Adi, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, yes, I would like to add something, and indeed look in a bit in a broader sense, as you said. The most important thing to remember here is that the issue of refugees is a political one and is part of the entire war against Zionism and against the Jewish state. Because if you look back, the Zionists came at the end of the 19th century with a very clear aim to create a Jewish state, to create an independent Jewish state. The Arabs rejected this idea, they refused to accept it, and they waged war against it. Now, in 1948, they lost because Israel was established and the refugees, and this problem started. But in the eyes of the Palestinians and much of the Arab world, certainly back then, the war wasn't over. So this was just battle number one. Remember that we only had ceasefire agreements. There was no acceptance of the Jewish state. To this day, we have this problem of a non-acceptance of Israel among the neighborhood. So in that sense, the refugees are one symptom of this problem. And it is not that the refugees have a legal right that they try to remedy. There is a political problem, non-acceptance of the state of Israel, and the refugees is a tool, is part of that war against Israel to start saying, oh, we have this right of return where nobody else had it, right? As Einat just explained, no other refugee had it. And then they start with the humanitarian aspect. Again, if you look at the details today, most of the refugees are not very different from the average in the Arab world. So it's not the typical image of refugees that one can imagine. So you have to start the question. It's not the legal issue who leads the topic, but the political who created the legal right. So when you understand that it's a political demand, everything falls into its place, and then you see that this is part and a tool in the war against Israel.
Thanks. We have got a lot of questions. Bente Erik has the first.
Hi, thank you, Einat and Adi. I just checked the UNHCR's statistics for refugees worldwide, and according to them, their number is 25.9 million. So according to the UN, in this case, roughly a quarter of the world's refugees are Palestinians. And I'm wondering, how do they come up with this number? How are they counted? And why is this number internationally recognized?
So UNHCR, which is the United Nations agency which actually deals with refugees and is responsible for implementing the Refugee Convention, and which, by the way, does not keep refugees in camps for generations waiting for return to their homeland, but basically, once they understand that there's no choice, they resettle refugees. We bring quite a few examples of that in the book. So the UNHCR, in that sense, is a very sensible agency that doesn't deal with issues of who started the war, who's responsible, who's to blame, what's just. They just try to find personal solutions for individual refugees, getting them to be settled in other countries. Norway has quite a few of them, maybe settle wherever they fled, but it's a very sensible organization. The 20 million refugees that UNHCR cites are actual refugees from recent conflicts who have not yet received citizenship or the protection of other countries. And UNHCR is constantly trying to find ways to settle them in other countries or wherever they are right now. UNRWA, created at about the same time, a little earlier, was created as a temporary agency. Amazingly, UNRWA now is still temporary. UNRWA just celebrated 70 years. And it's ridiculous. The last thing you should be celebrating is 70 years of a temporary agency that should have closed down decades ago. We bring another example in the book of UNCRA. Sounds like UNRWA, the K is for Korea, which was also a temporary agency established for the Korean refugees from the war in Korea. Their situation was just as bad, if not worse, than that of the Palestinians. Look at South Korea today. The refugees were settled within years with less money than was allocated for the Palestinians. And look at South Korea today, one of the leading countries in the world. And the Palestinians were subjected to what a colleague of mine called the greatest human experiment in refugees. UNRWA basically, as a result of the West caving into Arab pressure, was kept as an endlessly temporary agency that continues to register generation after generation the refugees from a war of 71, 72 years ago. Now, UNRWA basically is a loophole from the UNHCR. The UNHCR basically says we take care of everybody and UNRWA of the Palestinians. So when UNHCR publishes their numbers, they say, okay, we have 20 million from all over the world and 5 million from UNRWA. And they don't look into the numbers of UNRWA saying, look, by UNHCR standards, those are not refugees. You know, citizens of Jordan cannot be refugees. People who live in Ramallah and Gaza cannot be refugees from Palestine. UNHCR doesn't do it. It just takes the UNRWA number and adds it to its own number. And this is how you get to 25 million. But UNRWA's way of counting refugees is entirely ridiculous, is not based on any international standard. And in the book, we really detail how big the gap is between how UNHCR counts refugees and how UNRWA does it.
Just a very short and quick remark to this question as well. If you remember and understand and take into account that there is a political interest that leads all this project, then again, everything falls into place, because they don't have any, Palestinians, I'm saying, they have no interest whatsoever to lower the number of refugees. They have only an interest to make it bigger. So there you have it. And then you have a bigger and bigger number. That's it. So if you want to understand why, that's the answer.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to reading the book. I have two questions. One is that during the 19 years of when Egypt ruled Gaza and Jordan ruled the so-called West Bank in 48 to 67, how hard did UNRWA drive the question of the right of return? I can't find anything about it, nowhere. Maybe you have. And the other thing is that what can you do about UNRWA? I can't really see how you can dismantle it, because it's so into, I don't have the English word for it, it's so entwined with the Palestinian society. And I don't have to go into all the details about what they do and stuff like that, you know that. But what can we do about UNRWA? Is it reformable? Is it replaceable?
Adi, you want to start?
Okay, so let me perhaps start with the first part. And in fact, what we see and what we found in our research is that the demand to return into the state of Israel started in 1949. So we bring in a book, for example, an American reporter touring the Middle East in 1949, trying to see whether there's any chance of some kind of a rapprochement, you know, perhaps the war ended. You know, sometimes wars end the conflict because the belligerents understand that, okay, there's nothing more to do and that's it. But we find their documentation, and he wrote that especially the refugees themselves only want to return. And he even quotes a very nice, I mean, it's not nice, but it's nice in terms of literature of refugees who explain that they will bring their families and their young children to the hills, overlooking the hills of Samaria, overlooking the coastal towns of Israel. And he will tell his children to look down at the coast and say to them that these are the people, the Jews who stole your lands. So the interest, I mean, the impetus, the drive to want to return was from day one. Now, from 1948 to 1967, these were indeed territories, the Gaza Strip and the Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, was under Jordanian rule. Now, Jordan actually was interested in the beginning, and if we know the history of the Kingdom of Jordan, then we know that it's not, I mean, it's typical for them. They were all the time trying to make some accommodations with the state of Israel, and perhaps to this day they are more moderate in that sense. And they said that they are granting citizenship for all the refugees. So this is the only Arab country who said that all the Palestinians who are in Jordan, East Bank, West Bank, have a citizenship. And we found, for example, that in all the discussions that then King Abdallah, the grandfather of the current king, he had discussions in the beginning of the 50s with the Israeli government, and in no place he demanded the right of return. But this is the Jordanian king, because the Jordanian king indeed wanted to put an end to the issue of refugees. And as you know, because of this reason and because of his general attitude towards the Palestinians, he was assassinated. He was assassinated by a Palestinian because his perceived moderate position towards Israel. So here you have to differentiate between the Palestinian population, who really wanted authentically to return, and the Jordanian king. And by the way, he was quite alone because his government wasn't very much with him. And it is true that Jordan is the exception who tried to put an end to the refugee issue because they really wanted to cooperate with the state of Israel. Egypt, the same. The Egyptian government, and again, the driving force were the Palestinians themselves. You have to remember there were hundreds of thousands by then of people who said, no way. I give you another example. When Jordan wants to sign the ceasefire with the ceasefire agreement with the state of Israel, the most vocal groups are the Palestinians. They almost overthrow the Jordanian king. They make rallies. This is amidst the war. So always the Palestinians themselves were the most vocal force inside the Arab societies against putting an end to this issue. And the rest, perhaps, Einat, what can be done towards UNRWA? Perhaps you would like to say something?
Yes. So first of all, just to understand, UNRWA in the beginning, in the 1950s, has a mild and benign beginning. It's funded by the US and the UK, and like Ankara and Korea, the purpose is to settle the refugees in the Arab countries to which they're fled. And the US and the UK are willing to give a lot of money to it. So UNRWA in the beginning does not support return. It supports resettlement. But when the UNRWA and the Americans and the British realized that the Palestinian refugees themselves and the Arab countries refuse to cooperate with them, unlike the Koreans, for example, they basically want to close down UNRWA because they understand it's useless. And what we show in the book is that because of Arab oil, the Cold War, the fear of Soviet pressure, all of these things, the Western world caves into Arab pressure and keeps UNRWA open. And this is when UNRWA becomes, like you said, intertwined with the Palestinian identity. In many ways, it gives birth to the Palestinian identity in the refugee camps. And it becomes a Palestinian identity which is focused on return. And UNRWA becomes the organization, it didn't start out this way, becomes the organization that advocates on behalf of the Palestinians for return. Now, because of that, our response is that UNRWA is not reformable. After 70 years, UNRWA has become so much the voice of the Palestinian idea that 48 is not over, that there's still refugees, that they have a right of return, is that it's not reformable. There's nothing that can be done to reform UNRWA. It has to be closed down, period. And it has to be, and the money that the West gives it needs to be pulled away. Because UNRWA is a temporary agency, it has to get money every year from Western country. And Norway is a major donor. And UNRWA can only exist as long as Western countries give it money. Without the money of the West, UNRWA is useless. It can exist on paper, but it will not be able to function. So we advocate for the West ending its funding for UNRWA. The US has taken a major step in that direction in defunding UNRWA. And we believe that Europe has to follow rather than replace the US. And we also offer specific proposals on how to provide the services of UNRWA. UNRWA is basically the social service provider of the Palestinian people. So schools, healthcare, we show a path that it can be supplied by the government of Jordan, by the Palestinian Authority, by UNHCR when it comes to Syria and Lebanon. There are ways to supply the services. There is a way out, but the key message should be UNRWA is beyond reform. It's too intertwined, as you said, with the Palestinian identity of return. The only way is to close it down. Now, it's not that we think that if you close it down the next day, the Palestinians say, we get it. The war of 1948 is over. We're now refugees, and we don't have a right of return. But we say at least this will begin the process of a Palestinian coming to terms with the situation. For now, for 70 years, the West has been pouring money into the conflict. It's been pouring money into ensuring that peace will never happen. But at least once it stops, we at least have a chance. We don't have any guarantee, but at least we will finally have a chance.
Einat and Adi, we are so happy that you joined us this hour for the presentation of your book that is published in Norwegian translation. And I'm looking forward to get it from the printer Monday next week. We are really excited, and already 500 copies are pre-ordered. And we have around 40 participants in this Zoom meeting, around 20, 30, 40 viewers on Facebook already. So if you had scaled this up for the English-speaking world, it would be thousands of people. And also, we have viewers from Sweden, from Denmark, maybe also from Iceland. We appreciate it a lot for everyone who joined. The next question is from Rolf Kirchner, who is the former president of the Jewish community in Oslo. You go, Rolf.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting speeches. And I'm mostly impressed and thankful that you're coming from the Israeli left and not from the Israeli right, because of what you're saying. Now, some of these things, of course, largely are known to many of us who are interested in Israel and MIFF. You have already talked about the absurdity of UNWRA compared to the UNHCR. This has been discussed so many times, and I'm very happy that you're saying it straight out, that it's the social services and it's nurturing this dream of return. And to start with that, who started this nurturing? I mean, the dream of return, is it the religious background? Most of the descendants did not even live in Palestine, in the region of Palestine, in the 18th century, or even in the 19th century. There were guest workers and descendants of guest workers. So, I mean, the 1,000 years of Palestinian doesn't exist. So, who's nurturing this? Now, UNWRA, of course, now is nurturing it. And that's my one question. And to Einat, it's so obvious. So I'm asking you, I mean, how come that the West, the media, the majority of UN, you said already, had its political background, the Soviet Union background, the radical background, but they are still unaware of these facts or choose to forget it rather? Why? And I'm still looking forward to the key of how to unlock this mystery. But this is what we've been trying on a daily basis to write in the papers, etc. Thank you.
Okay. So Adi, you'll start with the first. I'll do the second.
So regarding the wishes of the refugees, so actually I think that both Einat and myself found that the desire of people who had to flee, and now I'm not even getting into the question of how they had to flee, it doesn't matter. But people who during war had to flee their houses, it is quite a universal wish or desire to return to your home. And it doesn't really matter if you live there 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. So we found that in Germany, when Germans were kicked out of Czechoslovakia, by the way, after the war in 1946, and not as part of the war, and much larger numbers and in a much more brutal way. We give a few examples in the book of the way that Germans were kicked out of Czechoslovakia, and they want to come back. And sometimes other people want to come back. So the desire itself to come back is not unique. As Einat mentioned before, what is quite unique, or very unique, is the nurturing of that desire. So the fact that they want to go back, okay, they want to go back. But the Germans, for example, and we tell this story, got a very clear message for the international community and slowly from the German elite and the German political leaders that this is not going to happen, that for Germans to go back to Czechoslovakia or to Poland means to open the war again. And slowly, slowly, in Germany, it took 25 years, from 1945 to 1970. Only in 1970, Willy Brandt, the German chancellor, came up with a speech to his German countrymen and told them this is not going to happen. And he signed a treaty with Poland. They agreed to the eastern border, which moved after the 1945. So they said they lost the eastern territories. So in 25 years, the German society, because of pressure, they didn't do it because they were happy. They would be very happy to get back their territories. They had no choice but to give it up. So this is exactly what we want to happen. And I'm a little bit answering also your second part, because we hope that if it was done with the Germans, then it could be done with the Palestinians as well. Perhaps we will be lucky and it will be less than 25 years, but we have to start someday. I mean, right now, the international community is doing exactly the other way around, pouring money, voting in the UN, pretending that this right exists. So right now we're sending, not we, because it's not Israel, but I mean, the international community is sending the totally wrong message. And before I'm giving it to Einat, just a very short remark about your, so indeed, this notion of eternal Palestinian history and nationality is of course very much exaggerated. As you say, we know that many families, even the most famous families which are considered to be Palestinians, like the Husseinis, we know that their origin is Kurdish, for example. It might be from the 16th century, it might be from the 12th century. And as you say, some of them, many of them came in the 19th century, in the 20th century. The numbers are a little bit not clear. So I mean, to say that most of them or the majority are not local, I am not aware of such research, and the research I am aware of is not exactly supporting that. But the bottom line is that they are much less authentically, historically, we're always there, as they want to pretend, or as Saib Arikat wants to pretend that he's that his ancestors are from Jericho, from the Canaanites or whatever. But on the other hand, the wish to go back wasn't the unique issue, but instead the response was the unique issue.
So the response of the West initially is generally rational. I mean, the Arab countries, for their own reasons, they don't understand why they need to compromise with the Jews. From their perspective, the War of 1948 was a battle that they lost, but they will win. I mean, you see in all the writings after 1948, they talk about preparing for the next war, which was 1967 and didn't go so well from their perspective. But as far as they were concerned, Israel's establishment after 1948 was merely a temporary achievement of the Jews, which would be undone within 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, but they didn't expect it to last. I mean, they look at the region, they say, okay, since the 7th century, this is an Arab and Islamic region. The Jews are like the Crusaders who came in the 10th, 11th century. We kicked out the Crusaders, we kicked out the British, we kicked out the Ottomans, we kicked out the French, we'll kick out the Zionists, we'll kick out the Jews. I mean, what's the big deal? So they don't see the establishment of Israel as a permanent change in the region, and they organize themselves around the idea that Israel is temporary. So one of the ways that they organize themselves around the idea that Israel is temporary is by preparing for another war, is by refusing to close down UNRWA, is by refusing to resettle and absorb the refugees. All of that is around the organizing political idea that Israel's establishment is a temporary aberration that will be corrected. Now, the Western world during the 1950s has a lot of issues, and this is just one of them. And the Cold War, of course, is the major issue. And they don't want the Arab world to go to the Soviet sphere, and they're very afraid of that. And the oil is important for the rehabilitation of Europe, for building the American economy. The Arab world is much more united at that time. The Arab League is a powerful organization. So when the Arab world and the Arab League tell the West in the 1950s, UNRWA is going to be kept open, we don't accept the outcome of 1948, we're going to sign ceasefire agreements, but this is not the end of the war, the West caves in. The West says, okay, you know what? We're going to pay X millions of dollars to UNRWA. It's a bribe. I mean, the West knows that UNRWA is useless. It's a bribe. And, you know, just like a little store owner pays a bribe to the mafia, and at one point they forget, they just paid regularly. This is what happens to the West. They pay regularly to UNRWA, and they forget the original conditions. Now, we are now at an interesting moment. The Arab world is changed. Oil is not what it used to be. The Soviet Union is gone. The Arab League is not what it used to be. And even the Arab world is beginning to change its attitude towards Israel, especially in Saudi and the Gulf. So the same conditions that were responsible for the West caving in to the Arab world are beginning to change. So we're now arguing that there's no need for that. The West can pull out of UNRWA without facing the repercussion that it would have faced in the 1950s. Now, you write that by now there's a whole mythology that some in the West have built about UNRWA, about the poor Palestinians, about how they're the underdog. But what we attempt to do in the book, and we do have that hope that it will have some impact, is we show that all of that is mythology, that none of it is true, that the whole idea of Palestinian return was created as a political project to undo 1948, that this is not a political project that the West needs to support. And the bit of hope we have is because of the changing conditions, we hope that more and more in the West will realize that they no longer need to cave in to the Arab world, and that they can pull out, just like America pulled out of UNRWA, and we hope that it will not remain alone in that. Not hearing anything.
Sorry, it's some problem with the mute here. Do you have time for a couple of more questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Good. So Kim Freddy asked the question in the chat, and afterwards, did you have a question, Jan Benjamin?
No.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so then Kim Freddy asked, how was your book welcomed by the Israeli left?
So the book was first written in Hebrew, came out about a couple of years ago. And obviously, as you can imagine, it was embraced by the Israeli right in a kind of, we told you so, we told you that this is, you know, they were never a partner for peace and for a two-state solution and all of that. Even though I certainly insist that this is still a book of the Israeli peace camp. Like we described, we want to get to peace. And our argument is that as long as the West nurtures the Palestinian vision of return, we can't even get close. let alone sign an agreement. So this is actually, in my view, a book written by people of the Israeli peace camp who still want peace, but just now understand how difficult it is to get there and are laying out the long path to get there. Now, in the Israeli left, there were two responses that have to do with what happened in the last 20, 25 years. There are those like us who basically said, wow, this is fascinating. We didn't know the entire history. This should be in every school. How did we not know that? So it's people from the left who realized already that the dream of land for peace was wrong, but didn't really have all the history and all the background, and they loved the book and they embraced it. Then there are those in the left, still a small group, who want to believe that peace is not only possible, which we say it is possible if you take the right steps, but that it's easy. That the problem that we don't have peace is that Israel didn't offer enough. So there are still those on the Israeli left, but it is really a small group by now who say that the only reason we don't have peace is that Israel didn't offer enough. Or they will engage in this saying, look, the Palestinians don't really want the right of return. They know it's not going to happen. Only if Israel offers a serious plan will they give it up. This is what we call the bargaining chip idea. The notion that the Palestinian right of return is a bargaining chip which they will exchange once they get the real important assets, which is the territory. Now, this is a legitimate worldview to have in the 1990s. This was the worldview of the Oslo negotiators, and we detail it in the book. They expected the Palestinians to give up the right of return once Israel offered territory. But the thing is this, Israel has offered territory. This is why I started the whole talk by speaking to the proposals of 2000 and 2008. Israel offered the entire territory, no settlements, no occupation, so that's not the problem. Capital in East Jerusalem, so that's not the problem. And still the Palestinians walk away. So you cannot seriously still argue that the right of return is a bargaining chip. And so there are those in the left who still make that argument, but admittedly, it's a very, very small group. And politically in Israel, I doubt they barely have 3 seats in parliament. And maybe Adi, you want to close?
No, I don't have nothing to add here.
Einat and Adi, thanks a lot for joining us. It was a great promo of your book. One of the participants already ordered the book while listening, and after we say goodbye to you now, I will make a sales pitch in Norwegian. So please accept our digital applause.
Thank you.
And keep safe, wash your hands, and we look forward to see you in Norway. Adi already accepted our invitation to come and give a lecture in our conference in Stavanger, the 6th to 8th of November. Looking forward to that, Adi.
Yes, me too, very much.
Yes. So again, you will have now a lot of ambassadors for your book and for your message in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden.
That's
and
great.
Keep up the good work.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Så med det våre israelske gjester ute. Jeg vil bare oppmuntre dere alle til å bestille boka, som dere da ser bak meg her. Krigen for å vende tilbake. Hvordan Vesten har hindret fred ved å mate palestinernes drømmer. Boka kommer som sagt fra trykkeriet på kommende mandag. Så ble den sendt til vår distributør i Kristiansand, og i løpet av slutten av neste uke så vil den da bli automatisk sendt ut til de som er medlemmer av MIFFs bokklubb, og til alle dem som har forhåndsbestilt. Så bruk kvelden I dag til å bestille boka, eller meld deg inn I MIFFs bokklubb. Kjøp gjerne noen ekstra eksemplarer, for dette en bok som glimrende å gi til venner og familie. Med dette så avslutter vi livesendingen på Facebook, og vi avslutter opptaket til